You just do that, my George. You just do that. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Far be it from me to not work anymore on Holy Week. My goodness. I might as well work twice as much, eh? Sure, why not? You are alive. Why not? Okay, thank you, Mr. Techman. All right, so we're going to start a little early this morning because we've got a lot to cover. We didn't get as far as I hoped last night. If you do not have sheets, raise your hand. I'll get some to you. We are on page 72. Okay, 72. Yep, I've got it. 72, top of the page. We're going to start at paragraph 5. We're still talking about Gregory the First. Quite an important character. So, before we go any further on him, I will ask if there are any questions or concerns, dilemmas, turmoils, or such that you want to. Yes, ma'am.
Observation?
Observation. Yes, go ahead.
I saw on the news today some rapper has a set of tennis shoes out for over $1,000 a set of shoes. They have human blood made in them. Come with the Bible verse, an upside down cross, and a pentagram.
Oh, nice. And your observation is?
The stupid idiocy of the pop culture that they would spend over $1,000 on satanic shoes.
Satanic shoes, yes. Yeah, I don't know what the point of that would be. Satan doesn't wear shoes. What's the point of half the stuff? Well, that's just true. Well, you know what the point is. The point is rebellion. Rebellion. No, the point is whatever is. As Paul says in his epistle, whatever is good, whatever is noble, whatever is true, whatever is right, whatever, they're the opposite. And they think it's fun and exciting and different and whatever to be the opposite. But the fact of the matter is, of course, that that is the normal. That is sinners. That is rebellion against God. That is the way people are when they come into this world. And so, if you really want to be different, if you really want to be set apart from the average Joe, then you need to be the opposite, which is obedient and peaceful and kind and benevolent and so on and so forth. That's what you need. So I mean, the other thing, that's the norm. So, but they don't think of it that way. They think of it, well, we're being imposed upon by these church goody two-shoes people who are trying to tell us how to live, and so why we're going to do the opposite. It's stupid. You're right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we need more people like Baker in Colorado.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, who basically says, I'm going to do what's right, whether you like it or not. Yeah, that's true. You do. You need that kind of thing. Yes, sir, Mr. Harry.
Reading Numbers.
Mm-hmm.
It illustrates God puts up
constant rebellion of his own people.
It's amazing to me that he would.
Yeah. One thing you can say, folks, is if you read through the Old Testament, you see, if you don't see anything else in the Old Testament, you've got to see God's patience with foolishness, God's patience with rebellion, God's patience with sin, basically. You don't see anything else. You see that. Now, a lot of people will look at the Old Testament and they'll see God wiping out Sodom and Gomorrah, or they'll see the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites being carried off to Babylon, or they'll see Nadab and Abihu fried to crispy crunch because they were drunk when they were trying to lead church, lead worship. And they see stuff like that, where they see the ground opening up and swallowing the rebels of Dathan, that kind of thing. And so they say, oh, look, God won't be messed with. God takes it out on anybody who confronts him or anybody who does what he doesn't like and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is, of course, it's the opposite. The fact of the matter is that the people of Israel had rebelled already a number of times before they got to Mount Sinai, and then, of course, a number of times after that. And the fact that he only killed a certain number by opening the earth, and then later on a certain number by angels and so on and so forth, actually shows his mercy. Actually shows he tolerates quite a bit. And if you look at Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, what more is that than an example of God's mercy? Because what does he say? Look, maybe there's 10,000 people living there. If I find 10 that are halfway decent, 10 people who are believers, hey, I won't destroy the place. And that's pretty amazing when you stop thinking about it. That does not show God being a hothead. Okay, that does not show God being angry, take it out on you kind of person. It shows God being a patient. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. What was that again? Noah what?
So with Noah and the ark,
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Noah and Phil were the only people that still didn't see God.
Yes, that's kind of an amazing thing when you start to think about it. She asked if Noah and his family were the only believers left by the time the flood hit. Now, if you do some mathematics, you find that Methuselah died in the same year that the flood happened. There are those who would say that there were other believers left around the world, Methuselah being one of them, that God allowed to die in the flood. I don't think that's true. I think Methuselah and whatever other believers were left, died before the flood happened. It could be in the same year, sure, but I don't know. You really can't pinpoint the time of the flood. Some Bible scholars have said it was in the fall of the year. Some say it was in the spring of the year. I don't know that you can really make a hard and fast case for a date or a month or anything. You've got to remember that the weather, the calendar, if you will, calendars are very often connected to growing seasons and things like that in most parts of the world. So with the world so much different before the flood than it was after, it's hard to say. So, were there other believers that lived right up to the time of the flood? In other words, that died, let's say, during that year, or even during the last few years that Noah was completing the ark? Sure, that's definitely possible. But by the time God seals up the door, remember it's God that seals the door, not Noah. Okay? So by the time the animals are on the ark, Noah's on the ark, his family's on the ark, the 8 people are there, okay? Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wife. They're on the ark, and God seals the door, and the flood starts. By that time, and it's right, there are only 8 believers. If our mathematics is close, and you do some extrapolation, mathematical extrapolation, you take the 2 people, Adam and Eve, and then you consider that they're living 900 years. Their fertility period, as far as Eve is concerned, if it's the same as our fertility period now, which is about 2/3 of our lives, then she is able to bear children for 600 years. If you just assume a normal growth rate of, let's not even say 10 children in 600 years. Let's even say less than that. But then they too are living a long time, and they are bearing children, and so on and so forth. A lot of mathematicians have put this to pencil to paper and come up with the lowest number that they've come up with. This is, of course, Bible believing people. The lowest number they've come up with is about 2.5 billion. The highest number that most of them come up with is between 5 and 6 billion. So think of the world before the flood as having as many people as we have right now on the face of the earth. And out of that group, there being only 8 believers. That's pretty astounding. Yeah, it is. Now, we don't know, very many details. Matter of fact, we know almost no details. All we know is that civilization before the flood was very violent. There was a lot of death, a lot of murdering going on, a lot of rampaging going on, a lot of anarchy. We don't know if the believers had, let's say, churches, places where they would gather together, or groups that they would gather together. We don't know how the believers carried out their life. I think it's pretty safe to say that their outreach efforts, if they had outreach efforts, and I'm assuming they did, because we're told that Seth called upon the name of the Lord, but that's public worship. Right? But whatever their outreach efforts were, they were completely rejected. And the greatest outreach effort of all, of course, was what? Yeah, Noah building the ark. If we're correct, again, we can't make a doctrinal statement out of it, but if we're correct that there was no rain before the flood, and no storms, and no hurricanes or tornadoes or anything like that, and if we're correct that the earth was 3/4 land and 1/4 water instead of the other way around it is today, if we're correct about those things, and the probability is pretty good that that's correct, then boats, ships, whatever, were probably pretty rare. You didn't see them, you didn't really need them. And so you could imagine people, building this thing, this giant thing, and anybody within 100 miles, let's say, getting wind of it, or maybe more than that, 200 or 300 miles, and going to see this thing, and saying to Noah and whoever else was helping him besides his sons, what in the world are you doing? And of course, we're told, the Bible tells us that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Now, that means two things. That means he preached the righteousness of God that is in the Messiah, and he preached the righteousness that comes from being a believer, that is the will of God. So he was a preacher of righteousness. He preached law and gospel. He preached the gospel. He told people, he said, put your faith in the coming Messiah, and so on and so forth. And again, here was a guy who preached for, 120 years, right? Something like that. And preached for 120 years, and how many converts did he make? That we know of. Zero. That's it. That's all the converts he made. And he preached the word of God, and he was one who spoke to God person to person. Right? So I always tell people these days, I say, look, if your church outreach program isn't working, okay, don't feel that. If your sermons aren't bringing in throngs of people, don't feel that. You're not, I doubt seriously, you're ever going to be in the same boat, so to speak, as Noah. All right? I mean, I can look at my records and I can find plenty of confirmation. Plenty of people have come to my instruction class, and the Holy Spirit has worked faith in their hearts through the Word, and join the church and become fruitful believers. Also, I had plenty of people get up and walk out. So I think of myself, hey, I'm more a success than Noah. That's pretty good company, okay? I don't consider that necessarily a bad thing. Now, is the church going to disappear? Yeah, for all intents and purposes, yeah. The visible church will go underground at some point in the future. We will be able to have buildings like this at some point in the future. Pastors will have to work full-time jobs in order to continue their ministries at some point in the future. Buildings like that over there, or even days off, let's say, to have church will be a thing of the past at some point. That will happen. There's no question in my mind. That will happen. And you will have to, if you are a person who wants to find the real gospel, the thing that's taught and preached here, you're going to have to look, and you're going to have to look underground. Okay? You're going to have, it's going to have to be done almost in secret. And that will happen. We know that. The Bible is very clear about that you will not be able to just see the Word of God being preached in public in a truth and purity the way it is today. Okay? That's coming. Okay? I don't know when. Maybe 100 years, maybe 1,000 years, maybe 2 years. I don't know. I won't be surprised. Okay? And when that happens, I'm not going to say, "Oh my goodness, big shock." No, I'm not going to do that. But the thing about it is, I think even then, we're never going to be in that situation that they were in the days of Noah, where there's 8 believers among 5 or 6 billion. I don't think that's ever going to happen. First Hannah had her hand up.
So, Noah had all of these animals.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to all the plants?
Mm-hmm.
When you overwater plants,
Well, what happens? What do the animals eat? Plants, right? Okay, and so what do you got in the bottom of the ark? A lot of fertilizer. And what's in the fertilizer? Seeds. Yeah. And so that's how the plants got reinstituted into the earth. And some of them may have been able to survive the water for a year. That's possible. The same thing with fish. Again, if our calculations are correct about the earth, and the water was all fresh rather than salty, then how did the fish change from freshwater fish to salty fish? Well, maybe a lot of them didn't. A lot of them died. But there were some that during that year, and probably in many cases, in many parts of the world, probably longer than a year. You remember, he's on a mountain, and he's able to get off the mountain and go down and start his habitation and plant a vineyard and all that kind of stuff. But it probably took a long time, more than that, probably took 2 or 3 more years, if not longer, for the water to go down in all over the earth to where it is today. So those fish had, and the fish are living, let's say, a year, or not even, let's say they're living 6 months, some species, they're able to have enough generations that microevolution, that is, change within species, can certainly take place, and they can adapt to salt water. Those that didn't adapt to salt water, of course, are no longer around. And maybe it took some longer than others. I don't know. But that's where the plants come from. That's where the fish and stuff comes from. The whales, the porpoise, and so on and so forth. They all survive. Obviously, they don't have to be taken on the ark, and so on and so forth. And also remember that there are 7 clean animals. So it's not just 2 by 2. It's 2 unclean animals, male and female, but 7 clean animals, 3 female, 4 male. And the 7th animal we feel is basically that which was sacrificed after the flood. The other 6 then provided mankind with a lot of, shall we say, better animals, animals that were less likely to pass on disease than the so-called unclean animals. The fact that there are so many pigs in the world just goes to show you that this world is just made for pigs. Boy, they have really taken over in a lot of places. So I saw another hand. Kathy?
Well, back to what you were saying about Noah being a preacher and not having any converts.
Yeah.
What about his 3 daughters-in-law? Their families obviously weren't, so he must have converted them.
Well, the assumption has always been, and I don't know, again, how you can say prove what's one way or another, but the assumption has always been that the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth were also Sethites. In other words, they were part of the children of God rather than the children of men. In other words, they were part of the believers. A believing church, if you want to call them, or whatever you want to call them, not necessarily converts. we don't know. We know that circumcision was not instituted yet. We know baptism, of course, was not instituted yet. When were, in the days before the flood, when were people, say, brought into the church? We don't know. There are so many details about that time, and it's 1,500 years in most cases. That is most estimates. It's a long time that we have no details about. We do not know how the church functioned. What his worship services were like. We kind of have an idea because of the way the patriarchs worship. But we really don't know. And we really don't know about any kind of, we know they did sacrifices. Because obviously Cain and Abel did sacrifices. We know Abraham did a sacrifice. We know Seth did sacrifices. And of course Noah, when he got out, he did sacrifices. Well, how did he do it? Were they whole burnt offerings? Or were they different kind of offerings? What kind of altar did he do? Was it just, only stones, or only wood, or both, or whatever? So we don't know any of those details. Did they have something like baptism to bring newborn people into the church or into their community, however? We don't know. And so it may be that they were adult converts of some kind, from the Canaanites. That's possible. That no one insisted that his sons marry fellow believers. And so maybe they were relatives. There aren't any laws against marrying your sisters at this point. Those laws would not come about until much later. And so they could be cousins, they could be nieces, they could be sisters. Obviously, who did Cain marry? Well, Cain married his sister. Who did Seth marry? Seth married one of his sisters. That thing. Was it still that way at the time of Noah? Could be, especially among the believing group that did not want to mix with the unbelieving group. And so it's hard to make any kind of hard and fast things about that. But if you want to give Noah 3 converts, I'm good with that. That's fine with me. That's fine with me. On the other hand, there are scholars also who, because of the actions of Canaan and Ham after the flood, they're not convinced that all 3 of those wives were believers anyway. Or stayed believers, I should say. Ham obviously was, and his kids anyway, and his grandkids were obviously not raised very well. Obviously. Otherwise Noah would not have cursed them. And his curse was really for the future generations. He said, I can see the way this family's going, and it's not good. And so this is what's going to happen. Wasn't really a curse on Canaan. It really wasn't a curse on Ham. It was a curse on their descendants. And the only way you can really justify that is to say, well, he saw that they were being raised in a very maybe unbelieving way, unchristian way, and so he said, hey, this is what's going to happen. But again, you got to remember the guy was drunk, so hard to say, how the Holy Spirit was working that way. Very difficult. Anything else? Nice little excursions on the flood. Yes, sir.
Well, I wonder about the Pharisees and the teachers of the law.
Yeah.
And Christ was preaching to them. And God said that He wouldn't let them understand.
True. Yeah.
Now, Pastor, what I'm getting at, where did this come from? Was it from back when they were coming out of Egypt and for that deal, or what?
No, it came from their time in Babylon, and they chose again not to worship idols, which was a good thing. But in place of the idols, they made the law their new idol, and that's why they couldn't understand it. And now I will say that the book of Acts tells us that a lot of these Pharisees converted after Pentecost. So Jesus obviously got through to them, and Peter too, for that matter. Yes, ma'am.
So Marty has a question back to Noah. She's asking, is it possible that Noah had other children that were part of the problem, as in did they die?
Sure. Very probable. Very probable, in my opinion, that not all of Noah's family were all believers. That he could very well have had other children, both sons and daughters. Remember Lot, for example. There's another example of the one person and his daughters, escaping barely by the skin of their teeth from Sodom and Gomorrah. But you remember in the Bible account, Lot had other daughters who were living with their sons-in-law, not in his house, but in their own homes. And they refused to go. They refused to leave. So Lot had children who were obviously either unbelievers or very, very foolish believers. You cannot say, 100% certain that every single solitary person in Sodom and Gomorrah all went to hell. That's going too far. Certainly, there could have been 9 believers in Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, maybe there were even more than that. I don't know. Did the angels take into account all 5 cities? They were in only one city. They were in the city of Sodom, which was kind of the capital city of those 5 cities. But there were 5 cities. And also remember that only 4 of those 5 cities were destroyed. One of the cities was spared because that's the one Lot wanted to go to. And then he changed his mind at the last minute and didn't want to go in town because I think he figured that if he escaped from Sodom, and people knew he escaped from Sodom and that other little city, and they would say, get out of here, you're going to bring the same thing down on us. And so that's why he and his 2 daughters wound up in the cave, and he got him drunk and had sex with him and everything, and a whole mess. But it is very likely that Noah had a much larger family. And then again, the guy lived, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and so he could have had a very large family. And the fact that he's got just 3 sons and their wives, and in these sons and wives, we know from looking at the ages in the ark, they're at the point, or actually beyond the point of where they can bear children themselves, their husbands and wives. And so, did they have children that they left behind? That is also possible. The cousins and nephews, there might have been a large extended family that most of which got left behind. Or as the Bible always says, taken away. It's a funny thing that the Bible always refers to the people on the ark as those left behind, and the ones who were drowned as those taken away. Just the opposite of the way most people think about it, and just the opposite of the way the Reformed, the Armenian churches, Baptist churches, millennial people teach it. Millennial people teach that those who are taken away are the good guys, and those left behind are the unbelievers. And that's not the way the Bible talks. The Bible speaks both in the time of Genesis and the time of Jesus. The Bible speaks that it's the ones who are left behind that are good, that are believers, and the ones who are taken away that are unbelievers. Always remember this, because they make a big deal about that. The 2 people in the field, and the 2 people grinding, 2 ladies grinding corn, and all this kind of stuff. This whole rapture nonsense, and that's exactly what it is. It's absolute figment of imagination. It's all. All right. Paragraph 5, page 72. We are finishing up a discussion of Gregory and make quick work of this. Move along a little bit. I want you to notice a couple of things in the paragraph 5. The first thing I want you to notice is that Gregory undertook the incorporation of already Christian. That's the key word in that sentence. Already Christian Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into the Roman Church. The point being that the Celtic Church was a church. It was a true church. It was a believing church. The Celtic Church was not worshiping trees. The Celtic Church was worshiping Jesus Christ, and in many cases, the Celtic Church was a more pure church, if you will, a less corrupt church, even at that time, than the Roman Church. And so the second point comes from that, down about the third or fourth sentence. This was precipitated by the marriage of the Saxon king to the Merovingian princess. Merovingian simply means those who came from the line in France. And so this conversion, okay, Gregory sent Augustine of Canterbury to convert the kingdom of Pantaroma. Okay. And the reason I put that in parentheses, in quotation marks, is because they didn't need to be converted. Okay. This needs to be understood. The Roman Church is ruthless. Even at this point, early in its history, it's ruthless. It does not brook any opposition. Anybody that gets in its way, even another Christian church, will be run out of business. That's the way it was from the very, very beginning. And we should not be surprised that it continues that way to this very day. That is always their stand. We are the only church.
They have so much to be proud of.
You think so? Next paragraph, paragraph 6. Let's look through that a little bit more closely. Gregory's other chief acts as Pope include his efforts as a tireless worker for communication and understanding between the Eastern and Western Church. So that's one thing. Because he was the legate or the representative to the Eastern Church in Constantinople for a number of years, he had a lot of contacts there. And so, even though the church was bound to split 400 years from Gregory, it could have split a lot sooner, very easily, without Gregory's constant efforts to keep the church united. Okay? So that's one thing that goes in his good column. He gets credit for that. On the other hand, his work as a liturgical reformer, that's a mixed bag. He did some good things, he also did some bad things. So, first of all, Gregory moved the Paternoster, the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, to immediately after the Roman canon, prayers to and for the dead, and immediately before the fraction, which is the consecration. And it's still there to this day. You may notice that. In our liturgies, especially when we have communion, other churches, the Lord's Prayer is always very closely connected to the consecration, to the words of institution. It's usually not separated by anything. You usually go from one right to the other. Some liturgies today, modern liturgies, they kind of split them up a little bit. They put the Lord's Prayer connected with the prayer of the church, and then put the consecration later. But in most cases, Gregory's change has been followed. And so that's something that he effected that is true to this day. Let's see. The position is still maintained today in Roman liturgy. In addition, Gregory added substantial material to the Roman canon and permanently established the 9 Kyries, the vestigial remnant of the liturgy, at the beginning of the Mass, where it remains to this day. So the reason we have the Kyrie eleison, where it is to this day, in the early part of the worship, is because of Gregory. It used to be much later in the service, in the apostolic days, and he moved it to early, and it was much longer. It had 9 repetitions of Lord have mercy rather than 3. So it was Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy, and then that was repeated 3 times. And the prayers were much longer involved in that. That change, by the way, took place hundreds of years later when the Kyrie was brought down to 3 and made relatively short. That wasn't something that Gregory did, but that's something that I think comes from the liturgy reforms of the time of Cluny, which are about 300, 400 years after Gregory. Let's see. Sacramentaries, actions which are not sacraments in themselves but aid the worshiper in devotion, such as genuflecting and crossing, etc., directly influenced by Gregorian reforms, are still to this day referred as Sacramentaria Georgiana. Yes?
Which is the correct way to do the sign of the cross?
There's no such
bottom, right, left.
There's no such thing.
You can do it any which way.
You can do it any way you want to.
Okay.
Now, if
We're
you're
just supposed
asking
to
me,
adopt it.
If you're asking me which was the first,
Okay.
that's different.
Okay.
The first was top, bottom, right, then left. That was the first one.
Okay.
And that lasted for 1,000 years.
And did that signify anything, or is it just
Yeah,
the sign of the
Christ is my head.
Okay.
Christ was in the womb of Mary,
Okay.
and in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, on the third day. Okay? Christ sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. Okay? And Christ protects me from the left side, or the dark side, which is Satan, and the sheep. Think of sheep and goats. Okay. And again, that was the norm. That's the way everybody did it. Everybody during the Crusades, during all the other times. Okay, until after the time of the Crusades. By the time you get to 1200, there has been a fraction, or there's been a division between East and West. East continues right to left. The Pope in Rome decided he wanted to see a difference between the East and West, and so he ordered everybody to change from right to left to left to right.
The goats are more important than the sheep.
Well, they don't see it that way.
Right.
They don't see it that way. The Romans would say that this side is the side of your heart. Okay. So Christ in my head, Christ in the belly of the earth. Okay. Christ in my heart. Okay. And then Christ at the right hand of God the Father. So that's
all Christ.
Oh yeah. In any case, it's Christ for me, basically. It was always seen in the early church as a connection between the individual believer and Christ himself. That's the way it was always seen. And long before you had invocations, that is, long before you had, beginning in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, anything like that, before you had benedictions, even from the Bible. The grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, or the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face shine upon you. Long before those were used in the liturgy, people just silently started the service this way and ended the service this way themselves. And it was a direct link, seen as a direct link between them and Christ. And that's why Luther, in the Reformation, Luther wanted to keep it. And Luther emphasized very strongly. And Luther taught in his Catechism, and you can read it still today. They keep the original words. Luther said, you should do this many times a day. And to Luther, it was a silent prayer. It was to him, it was a prayer without words to Christ to preserve us in our saving faith and keep us from the devil. And he would tell people. He said, if you get in a situation where you're scared and whatever, then do this because it is a prayer. He didn't say do it because it's good luck, or do it because it's a superstition, or do it because God will be nice to you or whatever. No, he said do this because it is a prayer. That's the way it always was in the very early church. That's the way it was, and somehow, some way. Well, I know Protestants all did it for the first couple hundred years after the Reformation. But when the Protestant church came over to the United States, a lot of things changed. And one of the things changed has to do with our bigotry. For the most part, Americans, the colonists, were very mistrustful of Romans. And it stayed that way for a long time. The first political party to have a convention to elect a nominee was called the Know Nothing Party. And their platform was no Catholics, no Romans, ever, should be elected to anything.
That's why there was such a big uproar about Kennedy.
Yeah. But I'm talking 1820s, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. And you think there were signs, no Irish need apply. That's true. But also there were signs, no Catholics need apply. All over the country. Yeah. The bigotry in this country against Catholicism, or Romanism as we call it here, was huge. And stayed and is still around in some parts of the country. It's very vehement. It's very human. And the worst thing, used to be the worst thing you could ever say to a Lutheran pastor. For a layman to walk up to a Lutheran pastor, the worst thing you could ever say is one thing that all pastors were terrified of, is for the layman to say to the Lutheran pastor, that's Catholic. What you're doing is Catholic. And that would scare Lutheran pastors to death. And the first time somebody said that to me, it was in my first year in the ministry. First time somebody said that to me, I said, you're darn right. It is Catholic, but it's not Roman. I don't get it. But it's a lack of education. And the know-nothing party, a perfect name for them, because they just didn't want to know. All they knew was those people, we don't trust those people, we don't like those people, want those people to go away. and there was laws passed in Congress. They were never enforced. I would say passed necessarily. They were proposed. Laws proposed in Congress to keep Romans, as we now know them, to keep Romans out of this country. If you were a Roman, you had to either give a loyalty oath to the country rather than the Pope. And it was specifically named. Or you were likely not to get in. That was the proposal. And then, like I said, it was never enforced.
Wasn't John Kennedy the first Catholic?
He was the first Roman. Yeah, he was the first Roman.
The first one.
And he had to address this with a special speech early in his campaign. And he said, I am not going to take orders from the Vatican. And there were many Romans around the country who did not like that. Because they figured, aha, now we're finally going to get ours. Yeah. And they were not happy when Kennedy came out and said, no, I'm not going to take orders from the Vatican. We got to move on. Also, thanks to Gregory, with the more frequent appearance of propers, the Western liturgy begins to show a characteristic that distinguishes it from Eastern liturgical tradition. Proper. Everybody know what propers are? Propers are the parts of the service that change with each Sunday of the historical church year. So, the intro, okay, that's a proper. The collect, that's a proper. The readings are a proper. Okay. The various, what do you want to say, expansions of not expansions, what am I trying to think? Well, there's a preface before the Lord's Supper. And there's a preface, and then there's a proper preface. And the proper preface goes with each season. And you may notice that. Some Sundays, like right now, the Sundays talk about the Trinity. That's in the Trinity. You see, the proper, before the Lord's Supper, talks about the sacrifice of the cross. As once by a tree he was overcome, now with a tree he overcomes. Okay. Or he overcame. But that's the Lenten proper. So that's a proper. Okay. The hymns are proper. Like I say, the readings are proper. The sermon is a proper. Okay, so those are all proper. The rest of the stuff stays the same. Gloria Excelsis, Gloria Patri, Kyrie, they stay the same. Creed, although we do go back and forth between apostles and Nicene, but still that's not considered a proper. The Agnus Dei, okay, Lamb of God, that's not a proper. Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's not a proper. Gregory was the one who really insisted on and made fashionable this change. 52 weeks of the year would have 52 propers. And if you add up all the possibilities of the Sundays, because of the movable part of Resurrection Sunday, okay, which makes Epiphany longer or shorter, makes Trinity longer or shorter. Right? There are, I think, 58. I'd have to look it up, but there's quite a few more Sundays. But each Sunday has remained pretty much the same in the Western Church until recently, until just a few decades ago. And in our church, it is pretty much always the same. I continue to use, for the most part, I continue to use the historical church year. Okay. Now, I should say this. Eastern Church, the liturgy is always the same. No changes. And the liturgy is a good hour and a half to 2 hours long. They still have 9 the Kyrie. They have a couple times spread throughout the service. Got all kinds of prayers spread throughout the service. Eucharistic prayers, very long, and so on and so forth. In contrast to the mostly invariable Eastern liturgical texts, Roman and other liturgies since they are a number of prayers and collections. Let's skip down to finally a system of writing down reminders of chant melodies was probably devised by Gregory and codified by monks before 800 to aid in unifying the church service throughout the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne brought cantors from the Papal Chapel in Rome to instruct his clerics in the authentic chanting liturgy. Pictures of the time were made to depict the dove of the Holy Spirit perched on Gregory's shoulder, singing God's authentic form of chant into his ear. This gave rise to calling the music Gregorian chant, though a more accurate term is probably plain song or plain chant. So when you hear chanting today, 99 times out of 100, those tones that the monks or nuns or whomever are following are from the time of Plato or soon after. He was a multi-talented guy. He knew many languages. He wrote extensively. He was a commentary on doctrines, commentary on Bible, commentary on life. He was a musician. He composed music. He composed hymns. He was a poet. He was a Renaissance man before the Renaissance. And so Gregory is quite the guy. Going on, paragraph 7, Gregory is the only pope between the 5th and 11th centuries whose correspondence and writings have survived, enough to form a comprehensive corpus. His body of work includes 40 sermons on the Gospel, 22 on Ezekiel, and 2 on the Song of Songs. Dialogues, a collection of often fanciful narratives, including a popular life of St. Benedict and a commentary on Job, frequently known even in English language histories by the Latin title Magna Moralia, and also a rule for pastors in which he contrasted the role of bishops as pastors of their flock and their position as nobles in the church, which became the definitive statement on the nature of the episcopal or bishop office. In addition, some 850 letters have survived in the papal register of letters. This collection serves as an invaluable primary source for the history of these years, and also one of the reasons why we know so much about Gregory as opposed to some of the other popes. Some of the other popes didn't make a big deal about keeping their correspondence or anything else that they did. Some didn't do anything, much at all, and some were destroyed by their enemies, either during their time they were pope or after, as you'll see.
First question.
Yes.
Earlier we were talking about the difference between the Eastern and the Western liturgy.
Yeah.
We're talking Eastern. Is that like European?
No, Eastern means Eastern Church, the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, that kind of thing. Eastern Church is the church that was ruled from Constantinople after the fall of the Roman Empire and run by the Byzantines. And
it's still being used today.
Yes. Oh yes, yes. If you want to experience a Eastern Orthodox service, you should go to the Greek church. It's on Prince in Tucson. I can't remember exactly where it is. Huh? Fort Lauderdale. That's right. Thank you. There's a Orthodox church, an Eastern Orthodox church, and pretty traditional, as I remember. They have they used to have, was it fall or spring, Mike? They used to have a festival. It's still I don't know. I think it's in the fall. It's in the fall. Real popular with people in Tucson. Love to go. And a lot of people will get their time, stay in a motel or something, and so they can go to the festival and then go to the Sunday service. And the Sunday service is something. I mean, you'd be prepared to stand for a long time. Wear some very comfortable shoes, and make sure not to drink a whole lot before the service. The service will take 2.5 hours, something like that. But it's quite a pageant, and it's very colorful. And I don't know if they still do it in Greek. We used to do it in Greek years ago. And they may still do that in Greek, and maybe have a translator or something. But it's really something to see. And you can, and because it's still the liturgy of Chrysostom, who lived in the 300s, it's still the liturgy of Chrysostom. It is basically unchanged for the last almost 2,000 years. And it's really something to experience. And you can really tell the difference between the emphasis between the Eastern Church worship and Western Church worship. Western Church worship is what we would call, even the Roman High Mass is practical, because the readings are chosen and the homily very often, and collects and the prayers and the Kyrie and everything is kind of directed to everyday life. It's kind of, how to get through everyday life. You're having a plague or going out on a crusade, or, the Turks are at the door, or, whatever. Eastern Orthodox worship is all about heaven.
As I traveled in my earlier years, out of country or whatever, and the languages, right? Mm-hmm. And I'd go to church on a Sunday, and you couldn't understand the word that was said. So I said, to me, it became almost pointless. It's like, in the United States, in the Catholic Church, they have their Latin services. And in some cases, I don't know how much of that they understand. But to me, if you go to a service, you can't understand what the heck they're saying.
Well, their catechetical practice was always, for example, my wife, before she made her first communion, she was taught the meaning of all that Latin, and her and all her classmates. This is 6- and 7-year-old kids, and they were taught what the meaning of the Latin is. They were taught the meaning of the symbols. They were taught the meaning of the actions that's going on, what the priest would do and not do, and lift up the host and this kind of stuff, and break the host, and all. They were all explained. The Catholic catechetical method is pretty much like my method today. My method today is taking the kids through the Catechism of the Divine Liturgy. In other words, going through here and explaining everything that is done in our liturgical service. Right? Explain everything, all the words, all the terminology, what's Apostle Creed, what do we call it that, what's an epistle, what's a gospel, just on and on, what's a Kyrie, what's a Gloria Excelsis, and that's the way the Romans did it, and still do for 2,000 years. And boy does it work. You can take the girl or boy out of the Roman church, but you can't take the Roman out of the boy or girl. I'm telling you. Okay? And I wish Lutherans would have done the same thing, but they didn't. And so Lutherans now are losing their youth in droves. They have been for a long time, but now even more so, because they refuse to do this. And even more so, they refuse to even do a liturgy anyway. At all, period. And so, the kids have no foundation, have no anchor. So the Latin Mass, I'll say this, the Latin Mass made them teach the people what the words meant. It forced them to do that. Once the Latin Mass is gone, and you have now the Mass in every language, wherever, there's less incentive to do that.
But what about the sermon?
A sermon was usually in the language of the people. Yeah, the sermon was. But the thing about it was, remember, if you're before Vatican II, let's say before 1963 or 64, I think in America it wasn't until 65 that the change really took place. But if you were anywhere, if you traveled to Mexico, you traveled to France, you traveled to Greece, I don't know, but you traveled to Spain, you traveled around the world, different places, and you went to a Roman church, you knew exactly what was going on. You didn't have to speak Romanian. You didn't have to speak Italian. You didn't have to speak French. Because the whole thing was done in Latin, and you were taught, when you were a little shaver, you were taught exactly what all, and you knew exactly how to respond. Okay? I can't tell you how many times it's happened, mostly back in Wisconsin, it used to happen more, or in El Paso. It hasn't happened as much here. And maybe that's because of time, but Back when I did a funeral in Wisconsin or in El Paso, and I would come out and I would say, "The Lord be with you." I mean, the entire congregation, everybody who was there, because the vast majority of them were usually Romans, would say, "And with you too." Except for the Lutherans, who would say, "And with your spirit." But yeah, and they knew that stuff, right? And like before the gospel, right? You know, praise be to you, praise be to Christ, glory be to Christ. You know, those exchanges were memorized, and they knew exactly how to say them and when to say them and stuff like that. So we can certainly criticize the Roman Church for a lot of things, but not for their liturgy, and not for their pedagogical style. They know how to inculcate things to young people. And their attendance among the young is not nearly, it's down certainly, but it's not nearly as bad as Protestant.
Pastor, I've heard many times just that we don't have all that stuff in our church.
Right.
We just believe in Jesus and
Paragraph 8. Perhaps one of the most influential comments by Gregory revolves around Mary Magdalene. In a sermon, Gregory once stated that he believed that the woman Luke called a sinner and John called Mary was Mary out of whom, or the Mary out of whom Mark declared that 7 demons were cast, thus identifying the sinner of Luke 7:37 with the Mary, it should be with the Mary, of John 11:2 and 12:3, the sister of Lazarus and Martha of Bethany, with Mary Magdalene, from whom Jesus had cast out 7 demons, as recorded in Mark 6:9. While most Western writers shared this view at the time, it was not seen as an official church teaching, but as an opinion, pros and cons of which were hotly discussed and debated. Interestingly, since the liturgical changes made in 1969 after Vatican II, there is no longer mention of Mary Magdalene as a sinner in Roman Catholic liturgical materials. Now, there's something else about that happened. And once Gregory did that, and it got to be common thinking, then Mary Magdalene became kind of the Black Madonna. And this is where a lot of later theories and mysteries are appearing. Mary Magdalene then became, in many legends during the Middle Ages, became the wife of Jesus. And they bore a child. And the child became the key of medieval mysticism. Right? You all have heard of the Holy Grail. Right? All right. In Latin, San Blood. What is a grail? Anybody know?
A goblet.
Well, in original language, it's just basically a container. Okay? Okay. However, there's a problem here. And we're not sure exactly when it happened. There's still a lot of controversy and still a lot of scholarship that needs to be done. But what happened was this. This actually started out as this. So this means holy container. This means Sang, like sangria, sang real, love of the king. And it refers to either one, Mary, Magdalene, and especially her womb, or two, a child of Mary and Jesus. This is also then known as the French. My French is not good. I'm going to do it this way. I think that's probably wrong. Maybe there's an extra E. I don't know. Pierre de Sion. Okay? Pierre de Sion. The legitimate son, or the son of the master, something along those lines. In Grail lore, the Pierre de Sion is very, very important. If you get into sometime just for fun and you want to have a little bit of an adventure, start reading into the Knights Templar and all of the stuff around them, and all of the stuff around the search for the Holy Grail, and the Arthurian legends, the Knights of the Round Table, and all of that stuff. This all kind of comes together. Also, Rosicrucians. Want to do a little research? Search the Rosicrucians, and they will bring together all of this stuff. To simplify it for you, basically what the feeling is this. In the Middle Ages, people are always looking for another way to go. Jesus was seen as an angry judge, basically. And people that were not comfortable going to Jesus directly. And so they were always looking for another way. Mary, the mother of Jesus, of course, filled that role nicely. But even Mary sometimes was seen as too aloof. She was pure. She was a semper virginis, the ever virgin. Okay, never had sexual relations with Joseph and all that. Okay, and so she was seen as just a little bit too high and mighty. So Mary Magdalene filled a very nice role for people. Mary Magdalene had been a prostitute. Mary Magdalene, therefore, was the Black Madonna, not black in race, but black as far as her past. Okay, and so she was kind of like us. You know, she had a messed up life and she had all kinds of problems and stuff. But she supposedly married Jesus, and had a child. There's some difference about whether she had just one or two. Some say she had two, some say she had one. But anyway, she had this boy child, and this boy child, in his line, the line of the Pierre de Sion, okay, the line is preserved, and supposedly out of that line comes guys like Charlemagne, okay, and other the world leaders we've had down through the centuries, okay, and supposedly the Knights Templar and others guard this line to this day and know exactly who it is in France or Germany. I forget where he moved to now, but he's one of the Bilderbergers, of course, and he's on the Committee on Foreign Relations, of course, and he's a Bohemian Club member, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he supposedly is manipulating the things of the world behind the scenes, and all the bankers in Switzerland and all this kind of stuff and all that. And so they know who he is, and they'll kill anybody who gets, tries to do something with him or whatever. And if you've seen the stupid movie Da Vinci Code, it's kind of messed up all in here too. It has a lot to do and all the different. Yeah.
Isn't that in direct opposition to the Roman Church?
That's what it has become. It's always been a schizophrenic part of the church. In other words, there are people in the Roman Church who have divided loyalty, if you will. They have loyalty to the Pierre de Sion, but they also have loyalty to the Vatican. And so let's put it this way, it's kind of a government within a government kind of idea. Okay, it's behind the scenes.
Because there can only be one king,
Right,
either the Pope
right.
or the.
And so, according to the theory is this guy, this person in this long line going all the way back to Jesus, he chooses, he's got control of the cardinals, and he chooses who's going to be there. Oh. That's the theory.
So the Pope is holding to what he wants.
Well, there's an argument as to whether the Pope actually knows this. There is some argument about that.
Well, we in Sierra Vista know this, so the Pope better know this.
Oh, by the way, when I say 69, that's when the liturgy, it took 5 or 6 years for the decisions of Vatican II, which lasted until early 64. It took about 5 years for those changes. They appointed a committee, and the committee went to work on making changes, and so it took at least that many years for a lot of these liturgical changes to be in effect. And so that's why there's so many years difference between that and what I said before about going from English or going from Latin to English. Okay. All right, we've got a few minutes. Let me just introduce the idea of what we're going to do now. By the way, I'm not really interested in a lot of the history of the popes after the Reformation. A few of them do important things, but for the most part, after the Reformation, after the Council of Trent, there's not a lot to talk about. Unless you want to get into the whole thing about how much mafia money is involved in the Vatican and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to go into that part of history. If you want to know that part of history, if you have specific questions about from 1546 to 2021, as far as the papacy is concerned, ask them. But otherwise, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it like I have Gregory, because after Gregory, everything changes until 1546. So from 600 to 1546, the papacy is a mess. And not because of Gregory, but but just because of the times. And then from 1546 to today, the papacy is pretty boring. It hasn't done a whole lot of interesting things. Okay, so when we talk about pornography, pornography is a very particular space in time that historians have labeled, as we'll see the dates here, really lasted from about the 900s, maybe a little bit in the 800s, until the Council of Trent. So from the 800s to the mid-500s, a long time. Gregory's influence was good for about 100 years, and then it began to get worse. What some historians label as a pornocracy, from the Greek porne, a prostitute, and kratein, to rule, or rule of the harlots, was an unsavory but colorful period in the history of the papacy. Most scholars mark its beginning with the installation of Pope Sergius III in 904, and lasting on and off until the Council of Trent in 1545. During the opening period of this era, the popes were influenced strongly by a single, powerful, aristocratic family, the Theophylacti, and their relatives. They were in particular under the influence of two powerful women, Theodora and her daughter Marozia. Marozia was the secret lover of Pope Sergius III and the mother of Pope John XI. Later, she arranged the murder of Pope John X, who had originally been nominated by the papacy by Theodora, in order to secure the elevation of her current favorite paramour or lover, who then became Pope Leo VI. Indeed, there is little question that both Theodora and Marozia undoubtedly held great sway over the popes during this time. In particular, as political rulers of Rome, they had effective control over the election of new popes. So these two women wormed their way into, they were very powerful, they owned a lot of property, they were rich, and they kind of wormed their way into the leadership positions in Rome, and therefore had a lot of sway in the Roman Church. And they were quite amorous types, and had many lovers, and chose popes who were also quite amorous and passionate, and they had many lovers. And so you had a mess. You had a moral morass, moral chaos. I listed most of them there. A list of folks during this part of the pornography include Sergius, the lover of Marozia, Pope Anastasius, Lando, John X, who was killed by Marozia, as I mentioned, Leo VI, Stephen VII, John XI, son of Marozia, Leo VII, Stephen VIII, Eurystheus II, Agapetus II, and John XII. He was a grandson of Marozia, and he turned the Basilica di Santa Giovanni in Laterno into a brothel where adultery, fornication, and incest were rampant. A second period of heightened scandal began in the early 11th century, revolved around Pope Benedict IX, who was Pope twice, actually 3 times, who lived a very openly scandalous and reprobate life throughout his papacy. The final and most egregious period of pornography led up to the Reformation and was partly responsible for calling the Council of Trent. This period included Pope Pius II, who had at least 2 illegitimate children, one in Strasbourg and one in Scotland. Strasbourg is in France, you don't know. Pope Innocent VIII had at least 2 illegitimate children. Pope Alexander VI had a notably long affair with Ranozia de Cantare, by whom he and his famous illegitimate children, Caesar and Lucretia Borgia. A later mistress of Alexander VI, Giuliana Farnese, was the sister of Alessandro Farnese, who became Pope Paul III. Together, Alexander fathered at least 7, and possibly as many as 10, illegitimate children. All these were illegitimate because, of course, the Pope was not allowed to be married. Pope Julius II, he is my favorite. If you ever want to read a fascinating biography, find a biography of Julius II. He was called the warrior pope. He was the last pope, I believe, to actually lead his troops in battle. Quite a character. Had at least 1 illegitimate daughter, Felice, and 2 additional illegitimate daughters who died in childhood. Pope Paul III fathered 4 illegitimate children, 3 sons and 1 daughter, by his mistress, Silvia Rufina. 2 other periods of papal turmoil in the history of the Roman Church deserve at least brief mention. The first is the Avengers Papacy, also known as the Babylonian captivity or papacy, and lasted from 1309 to 1377, during which 7 popes, all French, resided in Avignon, France, that's in southern France, and were under the influence of the kings of France. These popes were listed before. That's a good place to stop. But I get into some detail. Now, one thing I'll tell you, if already your head is spinning, don't let that bother you. There's a lot of names, a lot of dates, a lot of numbers, John this and Pope Paul that, and number this and number that, and so on and so forth. Don't let that bother you, don't let that get to you. I'm using those things as place markers so that I know where I am. Okay. Suffice it to say that within 100 years of Gregory, by the 700s and certainly by the 800s, the office of the Pope was bought and sold. Just like the office of all the cardinals and the bishops and the archbishops, they all became part and parcel of the medieval system of government, where the kings had so much power, and the dukes and the earls and the princes were beholden to them for very reasons. You could buy a kingdom, you could buy a princedom, you could buy a dukedom, you could buy an earlship, if you will. Same thing with the church. You could buy a bishop office, you could buy a cardinalship, you could buy these things. Okay? You can make deals with them. You could give away your daughters to get these things. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people got these positions, okay, both in the state and in the church. And remember that the state and the church were basically one. Okay? And it depended, and there was a big struggle between them. Of course, when you've got these two powerful entities, and they are supposed to be equal, you know what's going to happen. One always wants to be a little more equal than the other. Okay? So there was always a time during the whole Middle Ages, okay, from Gregory to the Reformation, where sometimes the church would be more powerful, sometimes the state would be more powerful, sometimes one particular king would be more powerful, sometimes the Pope would get over one particular king. I mean, it was a constant battle between these two groups. And again, some people were smart enough, wise enough, they would get they would buy earldom or dukedom or whatever for themselves, and then get their brother or some close friend or associate into the archbishop of that area. And boy, then they became really powerful. And the popes would do the same thing. They would put their relatives on as cardinals, make relatives out, and make cardinals out of them, or bishops or archbishops. And the same thing goes for Monsignor, the same thing goes for abbots of a monastery. All these things were very often bought and sold. And so you had a real mess in the church. This did not affect, for the most part, the peasants very often. Didn't improve their life, that's for sure, but it really didn't matter to them much. They kind of went about their lives. But it really impacted what we would call the middle class, and it really kept the middle class from forming or growing for a long time. And so don't let these names and numbers get you all confused or whatever. Just kind of go with me as I pick out the points here. And again, you'll hear names like the Medici and the Borgias and others like that. You'll hear those names woven into all of this mess. It's colorful. It's kind of fun in a way. It's interesting, but it's not real Christian. It's not real biblical. So, okay, let's close. May the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all.